Welcome to this third video in the series on Java methods. In this video, I would like to discuss how a method can receive information and how we can return information from a method. I will also demonstrate how methods can be called from anywhere in our program from multiple locations. All right, so methods without parameters. Methods that do not receive data means that it has no parameters defined. And so if you look at an example of that is in the pseudocode, it would be the display instructions method. We have the name of the method, but then we have the opening and closing parenthesis, but there's no parameters defined. And so essentially this method will probably have some statements and it will execute those statements. It could have a return value, but we won't be passing any information into the method. All right, so let's take a look at a method that does define various parameters. So let's get to the next slide here. So in this case here, we have this method called compute tax, and we're defining two parameters. One is double amount, and the second parameter is double rate. And this is when we're defining the method. If you remember from the previous video, we had to first define a method before we call the method. And so these are parameters that we're defining for this compute tax rate. But then when we call or invoke the method, these are called arguments that we're passing to the method. And so in this case here, the compute tax rate method will receive two arguments, and those be passed to the method. So let's actually do an example of this here. So we're going to jump back to an example from the first video, and we're going to do a method, define a method that accepts no data or has no parameters defined, and then we'll do a method that defines a parameter. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to first define our method within our class. Our class is called main. We're going to define a method. So in this case here, I'm going to put a comment, and I'm going to do a method that's called just the welcome message or the welcome method. So we'll say public, well, not to say welcome method that outputs text. And here we'll say public static void, and we'll just call this welcome. And then here I'm just going to copy this statement and put it inside of my method. So this method here called welcome, it has one statement that outputs welcome to this video series on modularization. It doesn't return anything, so we define it as void. But this is only defining the method. Now, to use this method, we have to call it. And so what I'm going to do here is call it on line 17. And the way to do that, we'll just basically give it the method name. And that's it. So this is an example of a parameterless method that doesn't have any parameters. So we're not passing any data, or this method is not returning any data from it. It's essentially just running a statement, and it's going to output welcome to this video series on modularization. The next method I want to define is a method that we're going to pass it. We're going to define first a parameter, and we're going to pass it some information. So let's take a look at that. All right, so this next method I'm going to call getGuess. So I'll say public static, and this time here I'm actually going to return something from this method. It's going to be the user's guess, and that's going to be in terms of an integer data type. So I'll say int, and I'll say get guess. But what I'm going to do here, before I actually define a parameter I'm going to pass in, because this method is going to receive information and it's going to return information, so I'm going to define a parameter here in between an opening and closing parenthesis. Now watch what I'm going to define, what I'm going to pass in. But before, I'll come back to that in just a second. But here I'm going to define a local variable, and I'll say int guess. And I call this a local variable because this variable is local to the getGuess method. So this is a local variable, and it can only be used within this get guess method. And then here I am going to do some ask the user to enter their guess. I just copy this here. These two statements. And I'll also name this get, and just to demonstrate something here, I'll say guess number, right? And this guess number is totally different from this guess number. So int guess number on line 14 is local to the main method, and then on line 32, int guess number is local to the get guess method that's defined here. And so the question is, I have the user entering. I'm going to delete these statements because I can now get rid of those because I'm defining them in my method. How do we receive input? And so we have the scanner object defined within our main method. Our get guess method cannot use this scanner object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a scanner object I'm going to pass into this method so that we can actually use the scanner. So what I want to say is the data type is called a scanner object. And I'll just call this scan. And so I'm passing in a scanner object. And so I could pass in any data type. This data type happens to be an object data type. If I wanted to pass in a number, I could say int num, and I could use num in my method. But again, I'm going to use the scanner. I'm going to give it the same variable name as in my main method. So cscn. And that's going to allow me to use this method in my this scanner object within my get guess method. So once they enter a number, I want to return what they guessed to my main method. So what happened is that let's go there now. We first define this method. So we define the get guess method. And then here, we've defined this method. Now, if we want to use it, we have to call it or invoke it. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to call this method, and I'm going to call it by its name, get guess. And I have to pass in this scanner object, so scn. And I only do as an argument, it's going to pass in the scanner variable, which is scn, or the scanner object variable, which is scn. So get guess is now going to hold a value. So watch this here. If I were to assign this and say int guessed number equals get guess, guess number will hold the value of whatever's returned from this method because we're returning a particular value from the get guess. And what data type are we returning? We return an integer, and that's declared within our method header. So just to prove this here, everything should run as intended. So let's going to run this program and see what we get. But everything should execute according to what we have outlined. And if not, we'll make corrections. Let's see here. On line 18, int. That's because I'm declaring it again. It's already declared. So let's run it again. So here, guess how many methods were used to create the program. Let's say 3. You entered 3. Program is ending. All right. So hopefully this demonstrates. So one, we have a method here that doesn't have any parameters defined. But then on line 30, we have a get guess method that has one parameter defined, and that's passed into the scanner object. And this operates the same, but it also returns a value. It returns an integer data type. So guess number is an integer, and then it goes back. So whatever called it, it's going to return back and hold a value. So get guess holds the value. In this case, we put in 3. We'll hold 3, and we're assigning it to guess number. And then on line 19, we just output the number that is being held within this get guess method. So hopefully that makes sense. I would say study this code. We could further modularize this program, but nonetheless, this demonstrates a method that doesn't have any parameters defined, and a method that does have parameters defined, but also a method that returns a parameter, or not a parameter, but returns information. All right, stay tuned. In the next video, we're going to talk about overloaded methods, and then give a good example of how you can use overloaded methods, and this is actually a way that we can conform to a good coding practice. Stay tuned. Actually, before I end this video, there's one small thing I would like to add here. When I have this scanner object defined as a parameter, there's something called pass by value and pass by reference. In Java, we're passing information by value. So what happens here is that when we pass this, or we define a parameter of scanner object, and we pass it on line 18, we're passing a copy of this scanner object to our method on line 30. And so it's pass by value versus pass by reference. Pass by reference is where you would pass the reference location of where that's stored in memory, versus by passing by value. So I just wanted to put that out there. Sometimes in interview questions, you will hear, what's the difference between pass by value versus pass by reference? And pass by value in this case here is passing the copy versus passing it the actual reference location, where you can modify the item that's stored at that location. All right, stay tuned.